Hey everybody, I've completed another solar orbit, so it's time for a video for the occasion. In this particular case, I'll be reviewing a game that I've actually wanted to cover on the channel for quite a while, but just have never really gotten around to. This is Arx Fatalis for PC and Xbox. What you'll be seeing throughout this video is the PC version being run through the Arx Libertatis source port. This is best described as a dungeon-crawling action role-playing game, which was developed by Arcane Studios and was in fact their very first game. And depending on which version of the game you were playing, it was either published by Joe Wood, Dreamcatcher Interactive, or Mindscape back on its original release, although ever since Arcane Studios was acquired by ZeniMax Media, it's been published under Bethesda Softworks. It was first released for PC in 2002, with the Xbox version following a year later, and the source code was actually released for the game in 2011 along with an extra patch, and from there we get the Arx Libertatis source port, which patches up a lot of glitches and weird issues that the engine has, among other things, and makes it a lot more playable on a modern system. So much so that I'd say the Arx Libertatis source port is basically required at this point. It actually makes the game pretty playable, as opposed to the original version, which is patched up, of course, these days, but still suffers from a lot of technical problems that were either outright fixed or at the very least improved with the Arx Libertatis source port. The thing is, while Arx Fatalis certainly has enough of a dedicated fan base to have a source port like Arx Libertatis, it wasn't really a commercial success for Arcane Studios. It just didn't sell well, even though it was received pretty well when it was originally released. And so, plans for a sequel just never really went anywhere. Arcane, of course, would go on to make the cult classic Dark Messiah of Might and Magic, which I've also covered on the channel before, as well as eventually making the much more well-received and much more successful Dishonored series, as well as the 2017 reboot of Prey, and then they would also go on to make a couple of stinkers, like Deathloop and Redfall, which is really unfortunate. That said, that was all after Arx Fatalis. Arx Fatalis was back when it was just a small French developer that wanted to make Ultima Underworld 3. That's actually what Arx Fatalis was originally supposed to be. They just couldn't secure the rights to Ultima Underworld, so they couldn't make it Ultima Underworld 3. But regardless of what Arx Fatalis was originally meant to be, and regardless of its commercial success, it has remained influential in Arcane's subsequent work, and it's gone on to gain something of a cult following. So, what exactly are we dealing with here? Is this a real hidden gem, or is it something else entirely? Well, let's just go ahead and start delving right in and find out. And like always, we'll go ahead and start with the presentation, which is definitely very dated. I mean, the game originally released in 2002, and it looked pretty good for its time, but has not really aged all that well. I mean, after all, at this point we're dealing with 20-year-old lighting effects, 20-year-old particle effects. We've got texture work that's pretty low res, the modeling is a bit blocky. The animations are pretty simple, especially with regards to the facial animations where people just bob their mouths whenever they talk with absolutely no proper lip syncing whatsoever. And of course there is the fairly low-res interface, which you get used to after a while, but on a modern display definitely looks a lot smaller than it would have looked back in the day. On top of that, the environments in Arx Fatalis are not exactly all that well varied. I mean, after all, the game does take place entirely underground, which means that you're going to be dealing with a hell of a lot of caverns, mine shafts, and things like that. Most of the environments are going to be various shades of gray or brown owing to the stone and such that they're carved out of, but that's not to say the game is devoid of color. It does have color in some of the more populated areas and some of the more fantastical areas. But despite there being pretty limited variety in environments and despite the age of the graphics, Arx Fatalis makes up for this with atmosphere. From the way the environments are lit to all the subtle details that are packed into various areas that really make them feel a lot like lived-in places, despite them being completely fantastical, it all serves to enhance the visual experience well beyond what the raw visual quality would have been able to achieve on its own. So while the visual quality itself has become clearly quite dated and aged fairly poorly, it actually doesn't end up being much of a detriment to the game simply because the amount of artistry and world design they put in more than compensates for that. And it also really helps that they've done a very good job overall with the sound as well. It does have a few issues, like the voice acting being admittedly okay for 2002, but that's really not saying much. Most video games back then that had full voice acting were really rough in the voice department, and Arx Fatalis is really no exception there, although it's definitely better than quite a few other games of that era, so there is that. But as far as the actual sound effects and what little music there actually is in the game are concerned, Arx Fatalis is a bit of an odd one there, because it doesn't really have a soundtrack as much as it has a soundscape. You see, there's actually very little actual music in the game. Most of what you're going to be hearing as you're wandering around the various environments is actually ambient sound that contributes remarkably strongly to the game's sense of atmosphere. When you combine the ambient sounds with those visuals, it's sometimes a bit shocking just how well it all works. It really gives you a great sense of wandering around and exploring a strange fantasy world where danger lurks around every corner. But while the ambient sound is great, the active sounds are a bit more of a mixed bag. I mean, combat sounds are not particularly great. They don't really have a huge amount of impact behind them, but they're not terrible. And occasionally a sound effect might sound like a stock sound effect, or just sound a bit odd given the situation, but it's never really a big deal. And when you bring all of that presentation together, you end up with something that is definitely quite dated at this point. I mean, the game came out over 20 years ago as I'm making this video. But the game's sense of atmosphere is just so strong that it really compensates for pretty much all of the game's issues in terms of visuals and sound. But as strong as the atmosphere is, and as mixed as the visuals can be, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay. The story in this takes place on the world of Arx, where the sun has vanished, and because the surface has become so cold and inhospitable, that the surviving humans have been forced to flee underground, setting up fortress cities that are kept in contact with a small group known as the Travelers Guild, who are the only ones who are sufficiently trained and equipped to be allowed to make the journey across the vast expanse of ice on the surface, which is required in order to venture from one fortress city to another. It's in this rather grim fantasy world that our main protagonist awakens, quite literally. He wakes up in a prison cell with amnesia. He has no idea who he is or why he's even there, and in the cell next to him is a member of the Travelers Guild who ends up giving him the name Shagar, which means he who has no name in an unspecified foreign language. After this brief introduction, you have to find a way out of the goblin fortress that you've been imprisoned in, and once you're out of there, it's a matter of figuring out exactly who you are and what you're supposed to be doing. Which is a lot easier than it sounds, because Arx Fatalis has one really nasty problem when it comes to the writing. It has barely any direction, and by that I mean that while you're given some very vague goals here and there, it doesn't tell you where you need to go or what you need to do when you get to where you're supposed to be. And while to some degree that's not necessarily that big of a deal, because you'll get to an area and you'll start to explore and start to piece things together yourself, the game does an extremely poor job of grabbing you in terms of storyline, because you just don't get much of a main storyline until actually a couple of hours into the game. And once you do finally get that storyline, it's only given to you piecemeal throughout the rest of the game. The idea is that there is an evil cult that is working behind the scenes to try to bring a dark god into the world of Arx and bring ruin to it. And the main protagonist is the chosen hero who must stop this from happening. All in all, a fairly standard fantasy plot, but the particulars are where it can get interesting and also kind of infuriating. Because along the way, you're learning more about the world of Arx, its inhabitants, the political situation, and all that sort of thing, and that's all quite interesting. The infuriating part is that even though the game does give you plenty of objectives, they're vaguely worded enough to where you're not really going to know exactly where you need to go and what you need to do to get there. So a first-time player is going to spend an awful lot of time wandering around environments that they've already been through several times and just wondering what the hell they missed. And sure, if you do that enough, then eventually you'll figure out what you need to do and where you need to go, But more often than not, it's going to be a pretty frustrating process, precisely because a way will open up in somewhere you've already been, and you just don't know it, so you spend an hour or more wandering around trying to figure out what you missed, only to stumble upon this one thing that opened up and you had no indication that it opened up. You see, there's a bit of a fine art to giving the player direction in a game like this. If you go too far with giving the player direction, you end up with something like Skyrim, where you basically treat the player like a complete moron who can't figure out anything for themselves. That's obnoxious and irritating in its own way, and usually results in the game being extremely boring. Arx Fatalis, on the other hand, is basically the complete opposite end of the spectrum, where they actively encourage the player to explore and experiment and just figure things out on their own, whether it be the solutions to puzzles given a very limited amount of resources and information for solving them, whether it be just trying different things and seeing what works and what doesn't, or whether it be poking around various areas and seeing if there are alternate routes or maybe hidden areas that you can access that might have some powerful gear for you, or they might have solutions to other puzzles or any number of other things like that. The end goal of that kind of design is that the player feels accomplished throughout the entire time they're discovering things, figuring out combos that work, figuring out solutions to puzzles, and so on. The problem is you have to be really careful with how you do this, because if you don't give the player enough, you end up with the obnoxious frustration of where do I go, what do I do syndrome. And unfortunately, that is a pit that Arx Fatalis falls in quite a lot, at least with regards to the main storyline. Once you're in an area that you're supposed to be in, it's actually not that bad. You can figure things out on your own in those areas because you're given at least enough information to be able to figure it out, and of course you can also experiment with things and just see what works and what doesn't. But to give you a prime example of the kind of vagueness that the storyline itself gives you, at one point in the storyline you are tasked with finding 2 artifacts and bringing them together so that their combined power will allow you to accomplish something. Sounds fine so far, except that you're then told that one of those artifacts was stolen by a rebel faction, and the authorities have absolutely no idea where the rebels are, and that the other artifact is being kept by the Snake Women. And that's it. That's all they tell you. Just, hey, we don't know where the one artifact is, but the rebels have it, and the other one is being held by the Snake Women. And while they definitely know exactly where the Snake Women are, they don't tell you. And no matter who you talk to, they won't tell you where the Snake Women are. You just have to wander around until eventually you find where the Snake Women are. At least the rebels have the decency of taking you to their camp and being like, okay, look, we have this artifact, but we won't just give it to you. You need to give us something in return. And the artifact we want in return is in the crypt. Of course, the problem there is that, much like with not telling you where the snake people are, they know exactly where the crypt is and won't tell you because you're just supposed to figure that out yourself. Now sure, by the time you get that quest, you're gonna know where the crypt is, you're just not necessarily gonna know how to get in because it's locked and you need a key. And of course, they don't tell you where the key is, so you just have to figure that out yourself too. And while this is only one example of this phenomenon, that is the extent of direction the game gives you for anything with regards to the main storyline. You're given the objective with very few, if any, specifics, and if you're lucky, they'll tell you the general location you might be able to find wherever that objective is, but absolutely no direction on how to get to that location. You're given barely any or outright no information regarding any kinds of changes in what passages are opening up, whether there's new areas that you can explore or not, just, go do the thing. And this happens for every single major plot point. It becomes practically impossible to care about the storyline just because you don't really feel like you're getting a storyline. Sure, it has cutscenes, which are mostly just characters standing around talking to each other, and sure, occasionally it'll cut away to a sort of slideshow style cutscene, which has some narration over it, but is otherwise fairly unremarkable. But while by the end of the game you'll definitely know who the main protagonist is, why he's there, what he's doing, and ultimately who the main antagonist is, and why they need to be brought down, none of it is really surprising or compelling enough to really carry the game forward. You're ultimately just going to be going through the game because it's just interesting to see that world and how you can interact with that world. So you end up with a fairly weird situation compared to most other RPGs. In most RPGs, the story and the characters are really the most important part of it, and the mechanics are just there to support that. In Arx Fatalis, the story and the characters are there to support the gameplay, which is, well, it's an absolute jank fest, let's be honest. Back when the game originally released, it had a lot of technical problems, and while they did patch a lot of those out over the years, some of them were problems until fairly recently with the more recent versions of the Arx Libertatis source port. To give you a prime example of this, one of the big touted features of the game is its spellcasting system, where in order to cast a spell, you actually have to draw the runes for that spell in the air in order to be able to cast it, which means that you have to have those various runes known. You need to have a high enough caster level to be able to cast those spells, and of course have the mana required to cast them. And there's actually a physical action involved with casting them, as opposed to just putting a spell in a slot and then pressing a button to cast it. You can still kind of do that to some degree, in the sense that you can activate a scroll that will bank a spell that you can then just quick cast, or you can cast a spell in advance but hold down the shift key in order to bank that spell for later, and you can have up to 3 banked spells. You can just press 1, 2, or 3 to cast whichever spell slot it is, which can come in really handy in combat, because casting a spell during combat can be a bit of a pucker moment, let's put it that way. But as if this system weren't interesting enough, as you continue to learn more and more runes, you can actually invert some castings in order to be able to get different effects. For example, the way you cast the healing spell is to use the runes for increasing something, and then the rune for life. But if you invert the rune for increasing something and instead use the rune for decreasing something and then the rune for life, you get the harm spell. But that's not noted down in your spellbook. You have to just figure that out yourself by experimenting with the various runes. And you can do this for a lot of different spells in the game. There are quite a few secret spells that you can uncover by doing this kind of thing, which is really cool. The problem is that the original implementation of this system, using the normal base version of the game even up to the current patch, the game has a really hard time reading your rune inputs. Now, you haven't been seeing much of that throughout this video because I've been using the Arx Libertatis source port, and that has a feature for alternative rune recognition that is far more accurate and actually works nearly the entire time, meaning that the spellcasting system more or less works as intended with a few hiccups here and there as opposed to very frequently having problems. But let's face it, when you're trying to cast a fireball and the game keeps reading a different rune in the middle of it, causing the spell to just completely fail, that could be really frustrating. The thing is, even with the Arx Libertatis port improving the accuracy of the rune recognition, it still has a few issues here and there, particularly if you're trying to do things very quickly. Not to mention, it does still have a few issues with reading inputs that are very similar to one another. But as cool and as janky as the magic system is, it's not the only system in the game that's fairly janky. Stealth is... honestly, I don't really know how the stealth actually works in this game, because I could never seem to figure it out. Theoretically, as long as you're not wearing metal armor that will be clanking around and thus decrease your stealth ability, as long as you're staying in the shadows and moving slowly using the stealth mode, then you can avoid detection. But it's also reliant to some degree on the stealth skill, and it doesn't seem to work properly. It's hard to tell exactly what's going on with it, because it's really inconsistent in how it actually works out. Now, I certainly didn't play a stealth build or anything, but I decided to put a few points into the stealth skill and try to be sneaky in some instances, and sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. Sometimes I would be really slow and methodical and use the stealth mode and stick to the shadows, and enemies will still somehow spot me through solid objects from another room. And then still other times, I'll just be standing out in the open in a well-lit space, and they somehow won't notice me. The end result was just so wildly all over the place that more often than not, I really didn't bother that much with stealth. I would use it when it was convenient, but otherwise, I mostly just stuck to walking in and throwing fireballs at things and whacking stuff with my sword. And frankly, that seems to be what the game is built around. There are actually a fair few forced combat encounters in the game, and some of them are downright punishingly difficult if you don't spec completely into combat and magic. Although even if you do that and you have some really good gear, it doesn't always matter because there's always something that can absolutely demolish you. Some of which is just flat out unfair, like with the Liches, where they can cast a spell at you that just kills you instantly. And there's absolutely nothing you can do to defend against it other than simply not get hit by the spell in the first place. That even includes turning God mode on, by the way. That spell will still kill you instantly even if you have God mode on. It is bullshit. And no, unfortunately you can't learn that spell yourself, it's just some ability that the Liches have. And funnily enough, the Liches actually aren't even the only thing that can just kill you instantly even if you have God mode on, so I guess abandon all hope, ye who enter here, not even cheat codes can save you now. In all seriousness though, those kinds of things are actually quite few and far between. Most of the time, it's definitely challenging, sometimes even punishingly difficult, but there are ways of defeating the scenarios that the game confronts you with. Whether it be the janky things like exploiting the game's rather poor AI, which is actually something I don't really count much against the game because that was a fairly common problem for that era in general, so worth noting there. Or whether it be just buffing yourself up with spells like haste and then wailing on enemies until they go down, or of course blasting them from afar with whatever powerful spells you have, or using spell scrolls to your advantage. And sometimes you can use the environment to your advantage, or you might even have to use the environment to your advantage when dealing with certain things. The point is that while the game is certainly very difficult, and it is very bad at giving the player direction, it's still not insurmountable. You can still find ways of defeating enemies, defeating puzzles, defeating various situations in order to progress to the next thing. The trick there is that you have to be very patient and you have to explore the living crap out of everything. Leave no stone unturned. If something looks like it might be useful, throw it in your inventory and carry it around. You never know when you might be able to use it later to solve some weird puzzle, or maybe combine it with something else to craft a useful item, or maybe even use it to be able to enchant gear. There is a remarkable amount of things you can do in this game that really give it a lot of extra spice. Things like being able to brew your own potions by grinding up materials with a mortar and pestle, putting them in bottles, and then using those bottles at a still. Things like being able to cook food, whether it be simply tossing a raw fish or raw ribs or whatever next to a campfire or on a stove or something and then waiting for it to cook, or even being able to grab some flour, combine it with water to create dough, and then throw that dough either onto a stove or into a campfire or whatever to create bread. Carry around a pickaxe so you can mine gems off the walls in some of the caverns, or carry around a shovel so you can dig things up in certain areas. Hell, there are several sections of the main storyline that are actually fairly non-linear and you can just do them out of order. And while the better gear in the game has higher stat requirements, as long as you meet those stat requirements, it doesn't matter where you are in the game, you can still equip it. So you could find a ridiculously powerful weapon or really good armor early on, and as long as you have the stats to equip it, you can equip it and it'll make your life a lot easier. And there's no level scaling or any of that kind of crap. You go into an area and whatever's there has its stats regardless of whether you're going in at level 1 or going in at max level. It's all built around design principles that I would describe as unrepentingly old school. You're given a world to explore and interact with, and while they do have some constraints on the manner in which you can interact with it, it being effectively a dungeon crawler, there is just absolutely no hand-holding outside of the most basic of tutorials and the very basic journal system. They'll tell you things like how to move around, how to interact with objects in the world, how to use the stealth mode to sneak around, how to cast a spell, things like that, but pretty much everything else you need to figure out for yourself, and while in a mechanical sense, that's mostly fine because a lot of the fun of this game actually comes from experimenting and exploring and just seeing what you can do. At the same time, the lack of direction from the story leads to some frustration with trying to navigate the world and actually figure out what it is you're supposed to be doing. And all of the mechanics have just weird quirks to them, like the way the magic system is just set up in general, or they don't necessarily work properly, like, again, the magic system sometimes. and the stealth system being weird. Or they might just be kind of an afterthought, like ranged combat, which is a thing in this game. You can use bows and arrows, but they're pretty terrible, so there's not really much reason to. And even when something is working as intended, it may not necessarily be all that engaging in and of itself, like the melee combat, where you draw your weapon and then press and hold the attack or really just interact button in order to charge up a swing. You'll notice that the gem at the bottom of your screen's heads-up display fills up over time, and once it's full, then you're going to use a max power strike. Sometimes you get a critical hit, which does double damage, and you just don't really have any way of knowing when the criticals are going to trigger, or why they trigger, or what your critical rate is, or anything like that. It just is something that happens. And there's no parrying or dodging or anything like that. You just either tank a hit or it just doesn't hit you. It's a fairly sluggish and clunky system, but it's also rather reminiscent of the way Ultima Underworld handled combat, so it's not really surprising. Remember, this was originally supposed to be Ultima Underworld 3, but they couldn't secure the rights for it. It was designed from the ground up to be that unrepentant, old-school design that Ultima Underworld had, and that included a lot of elements that were really janky when Ultima Underworld did them. And so, by the time Arx Fatalis came out, there weren't that many developers that had even attempted things like that, and since very few, if any, other developers were even attempting stuff like that in the years leading up to the development and release of Arx Fatalis, Arcane was working with some ideas that simply hadn't been developed very much, or really developed even at all, and so there's really only so much they could have done at that time. Could the game have been better? Well, absolutely. They could have patched out a lot more of the bugs, they could have made the magic casting system much more responsive, they could have improved the movement, because movement in this game is kind of weird and sluggish and clunky and a bit hard to describe. It's like you don't really have full control over your character, and particularly when you try to jump on things or if you try to use the levitate spell, it can just behave in really odd ways and just make you get stuck in one place or any number of things like that. The stealth mechanics in particular could use a lot of retooling. The combat could definitely be ironed out a lot more. I mean, you can't even hold your shield up to block incoming attacks, it just gives you a passive armor bonus. And while I'm certainly not opposed to the idea of the grid-based inventory system, they definitely could have handled the interface and controls for it a lot better. Because while you can certainly get used to the actual mechanics of going into your inventory, double-clicking on an item to select it, and then clicking on something in the environment to interact with using it, or of course selecting an item in your inventory and then clicking on another item in your inventory to try to combine them, or if you want to consume the item, like say a healing potion or something along those lines, and you hover over it and then press the use key in order to consume it, actually moving things around in your inventory to try to organize things, or just moving things in or out of your inventory and throwing them in the world or whatever, can get really messy, especially when you drop an item in the world and it disappears into the floor. On top of all of that, the journal system is basically the exact same way Morrowind handled its journal, except that you don't have anywhere near as many entries in the journal, so it's actually fairly manageable by comparison. But it's still just a stream of consciousness going from one note to the next note, regardless of whether it's in any kind of order or attached to any kind of quests or anything like that, making it difficult to follow what's going on in the journal without just going back and forth between pages. It is undeniably a clunky, janky game that definitely needs improvement. Improvements which really even go beyond the scope of something like the Arx Libertatis source port, because at least that sorts out a lot of the technical problems the game has, but it's just a source port. It's not going to fundamentally alter the entire gameplay experience to introduce new combat mechanics or overhaul the existing mechanics. It's just going to go in there and fix glitches and various technical problems that the game has and make sure that it runs properly on a modern operating system with modern resolution support and things like that. Now, the kinds of improvements that Arx Fatalis really needs are the kind of things that you would see with a proper, well-developed sequel, which it never got. Poor sales back when the game originally released made it so that they just couldn't really secure funding for a sequel. I mean, if the original game didn't sell well, then why would a sequel sell well? So they ended up having to go and make other games, and we got some really fantastic stuff out of that, like Dark Messiah of Might and Magic. which if you think about it, has a lot of the same design ideas that Arx Fatalis does. It's just in a much more linear, much more narrowly focused sense. And of course, things like world reactivity and just the believability of the world in general, with all those subtle touches, are things that Arcane would carry forward into their subsequent games as well. It's just that what you're getting from Arx Fatalis is all these ideas, all these design principles, in their roughest, least refined state. And as a result, you end up with a game that if you're just trying to play it, whether you're trying to play it from a historical perspective of wanting to know where Arcane Studios got their start, or somebody just recommended the game to you and you decide to give it a try, you end up with a game that can be described as peaks and valleys. The valleys can be downright infuriating. Those moments where you're just wandering around going, okay, where the hell am I going and what the hell am I doing? Or the game throws you up against a certain enemy that is so ridiculously powerful compared to what you can do that it seems like it's damn near impossible to beat it. And then the peaks are those moments where you do manage to overcome those overwhelmingly powerful enemies, or you manage to find some weird secret hidden in a crypt somewhere that gets you a really powerful piece of equipment, or you solve a complicated puzzle, or you manage to find a tricky solution to something that is just wildly out there and think to yourself, holy crap, I can't believe that worked. Or you have those slower moments that aren't the where do I go, what do I do, that you're just wandering around and exploring and you're just soaking in the game's stellar atmosphere. It is a game that all but guarantees, even if you are able to get past the almost complete lack of direction, even if you are able to get past the often downright punishing difficulty, you're probably still going to have a love-hate relationship with it. You'll be able to love the world design and the interactivity you have with it, the sense of exploration and satisfaction you get from just experimenting with things. But with so much of the game being plagued with technical problems, even if they're not particularly significant technical problems anymore with the Arx Libertatis source port, or just really janky design, or just straight-up undeveloped design, or of course those situations where the game just throws something at you that is just straight up unfair to deal with, you'll inevitably find something that you'll grow to hate about it. It is a weird game. The experience of playing it is something of a roller coaster of emotions, but at the end of the day, it is really the closest thing we've gotten to a proper follow-up to Ultima Underworld, and that comes with a lot of design quirks that just aren't really replicated anywhere else. I mean, sure, there was Underworld Ascendant a few years ago, but that was a long time between Ultima Underworld, Arx Fatalis, and ultimately Underworld Ascendant, and from everything I've seen, because I haven't actually messed with Underworld Ascendant yet, I have a copy of it, just haven't gotten around to it yet, but from everything I've seen, it still didn't really nail it. Arx Fatalis certainly didn't nail it either, but the end result was still a unique experience that I can recommend to people who have the patience to put up with it, which unfortunately is just not going to be very many of you. Between the complete lack of handholding to the point where they just don't give you enough direction, the janky mechanics, and the often downright punishing difficulty, it takes a ridiculously patient or downright masochistic player to really get the most out of Arx Fatalis. Because once you get past those issues, there is stuff in there to really latch onto and really enjoy. But you really have to work at it a while before you can start to get to the really good stuff. Ultimately, I do give this a 3.5 out of 5 with that stipulation. If you have the patience to put up with all of those issues long enough to get to the really good stuff that Arx Fatalis does, you'll almost certainly enjoy it. But if you don't have that level of patience, then you will almost certainly despise your time with Arx Fatalis. But then again, these days, a copy of Arx Fatalis is ridiculously cheap. I mean, after all, when it's not on sale, they're charging $5 US for it on GOG and Steam. And I'd certainly recommend the GOG version over the Steam version. It's a bit easier to get the Arx Libertatis port up and running on it. Not to mention the whole DRM free thing, although I think on the Steam version it's also technically DRM free, but I'm not 100% sure on that. Anyway, that's the current price they have set for it when it's not on sale, and when it is on sale, it usually goes for less than $2. At that price, you might as well give it a try anyway. If nothing else, just to experience a bit of gaming history and try out something that is really quite unique in the grand scheme of things. There are very few games out there that are quite like Arx Fatalis. I mean, after all, the only ones I can really attest to in any meaningful sense are Ultima Underworld 1 and 2. I can't speak for Underworld Ascendant, although I will certainly take a look at it eventually, but those are the only ones I can really think of that are in the same vein, and frankly, that makes sense. After all, Arx Fatalis was originally supposed to be Ultima Underworld 3, and funnily enough, so was Underworld Ascendant. So if you're interested in having a very unique gameplay experience, then, well, Arx Fatalis will certainly fit that bill. Just understand what you're getting yourself into first. It is definitely a rough ride. Thank you all very much for watching, and if you like my channel, please consider supporting it on Patreon. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that is perfectly fine, I understand, but the option's there if you're interested. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you all in later videos.